Okay, so there's actually quite a few different ways to measure international candidates. You can measure based on where they sat for the examination. You can measure based on the home address they put into the application process. You can measure based on whether they're an international, if they sat internationally, or whether or not they went to an educational institution that's overseas. So we actually selected a couple different ways to measure it when I'm presenting it. And the primary way I typically look at international candidates based on the home of record or the home address that they put in. You could imagine that there's at least a few candidates who are U.S. citizens educated in the U.S. who happen to be working in Japan or Australia who may be considered international because they're either expats or working temporarily there. But by and large, this is rather accurate information, accurate data. The data kind of shows the impact to the jurisdictions, meaning whether it's a change in rules or candidate behavior, sort of how candidates are being drawn to various jurisdictions. And then some of it we're going to talk about is the impact from jurisdictions. When a jurisdiction makes what's apparently a small change or even a large change, you'll see very dramatic candidate behavior changes. Maybe they're going from Maine now to Delaware or a different state. And it's actually very pronounced when you look at multi-year trends. Some of the performance we look at, and we could probably have a multi-day session on this thing, but we picked out a couple of the trends that we think are the most interesting that should drive a lot of discussion, and we'll spend no more than about 15 minutes going through the data component before we get back into the discussion part. And then we'll talk a little bit about the path of least resistance, and I think the impact of the wide array of standards across jurisdictions and how that affects candidates. And then I think Ted's going to get back into the change in board rules, and then maybe a light commentary about the growth in China. It's very, very dramatic, and we may see in the next couple decades Chinese candidates outnumbering U.S. candidates if they continue even part of the growth rate that we're seeing right now, and what sort of implications is that going to have to the CPAs and the jurisdictions. And then resurgence in Japan growth, and I say resurgence, we see a slight uptick compared to before, probably not what we had expected. Here's the I think many of you all may have seen the candidate performance book. This first slide really just is found in the annual candidate performance book that we publish. And it shows the two main countries. We had Japan, Korea, honestly, India and Canada were the top four for many, many years. And you could see some rapid declines in the total number of candidates. Japan, between 2009 and 12, was down 12%. Where's my laser? Korea, 20%, Canada, 42%, and India, 32%. Each of these countries are down, we think, for various different reasons. Indian candidates, I think a lot of rule changes that are happening, particularly in places like Colorado, are closing the door to their type of education. So they're looking at ways to get into other jurisdictions. I think a lot of them have not been successful finding those. Then you see other locations, China, 394% growth between 2009 and 2012, which is tremendous. And I think for several years we've seen 100% year-over-year growth in that area. So imagine even if it's 40 to 50% annual growth, what those numbers are going to be like in 5 or 6 years. And the initial data that we've seen in 2013, there's strong indication that China this year is going to overtake South Korea with a total number of candidates, which is a big change. I think China was maybe number 40 or 50 5 or 6 years ago as far as the number of candidates coming through the process. And then Middle East, we've seen, again, a huge ramp up in places like Bahrain and Palestinian territories, which are down a little bit lower on the rankings. We think that growth is moderating quite a bit. I think some of the data I've seen from AICPA and the examination shows that as well. Here's a kind of a look at the overall trending. You can see the overall candidates, including domestic and international, and you'll see the third quarter spikes in performance due to the recent graduates, and then the recovery from the transition to CBTE after the spike. For international candidates, and again, these are candidates that have an international address associated with their application, you saw a much larger relative spike prior to 2011. I think they were a little bit more antsy about the changes to the examination, so wanted to sort of get it out of the way. So a much larger drop and then a recovery that seems to be about on pace candidate-wise with where they were prior to the change. However, the number of sections have declined per candidate. And this may, again, be related to the examination being easier to access in places like Japan and the Middle East where the examination is being process. I've got 4 more slides. We can do this analysis for just about every country, and the interesting ones are South Korea, India. We may want to look at Canada. I picked Japan and then Middle East in general because these two are very, very different related to candidate behavior. And you'll see Japanese candidates, if you looked at this chart right here, oh, sorry, wrong button. This chart right here, pie chart, or I guess it's a donut chart. About 4 or 5 years ago, the Japanese candidates were heavily skewed towards Maine, some New Hampshire, with very, very few candidates going to other locations. We fast forward to 2012. After the rule changes happened in Maine, earlier in 2012, candidate behavior is moderating so that there's not a bias towards 1 or 2 different jurisdictions there. And there's a bias probably towards 5 or 6 different jurisdictions, but they're relatively evenly spread out, which is sort of interesting. I think before, a lot of the candidates in Japan, Korea, many of the other countries were going to where their peers had gone to or where their firm recommends that they go to, or where they've been going to for several years. If you look at this chart, the blue, dark blue line, you guys can see it on your handout as well, shows where they were in 2008 and then where they exist in 2012. What this doesn't show you, I'm not sure if you all remember the changes to the examination or the rules in Maine that happened in, I think, Q1 or Q2 of 2008, just before we really started collecting this data. They had removed any requirement to have accounting education as part of the requirement. So you could have a degree, any degree in any topic and sit for the examination. They went from having a couple hundred candidates and maybe 40 to 50% outside the state to, I think, 3,600 candidates in 2010. It spiked that rapidly. As soon as a rule change happened in 2012, pretty much every candidate left Maine and went to other jurisdictions based on where their education now more closely fit, places like maybe New Hampshire and Montana, some of the other locations. The candidate section, let me kind of get moving along here a little bit. This is an interesting one as well. You know, we looked, there's some questions about international education. Is it equivalent to the United States? So I would imagine if there was a wide difference between U.S. education versus education in Japan, it would be seen in the performance of candidates. So we did a quick analysis, and you could see a vast majority of candidates actually go to school in Japan, and the performance of Japanese candidates historically have been slightly higher than those who have come to the United States to get education. And those numbers are getting rather close. And again, this is not incredibly valid statistically because there's such a low number of individuals now from Japan who are educated in the US, but there's not a huge performance difference there, which was sort of a good thing for us to see. And I can't, there's a laser pointer. The note here, the adoption of the Japanese test centers, candidates moving from sitting in Guam, Hawaii, Alaska to Japanese test centers was rather quick. I think less than 10% now, less than 5% actually sit in Guam. Just about everybody else sits. And Dave Sanford loves this trend. The interesting note here that I saw was the performance difference. You know, we've seen over the last 3 or 4 quarters that the individuals who are choosing to sit in Guam or continue to sit in Guam, their performance is dropping dramatically relative to their peers who are sitting in Japan. Not really sure the nature of the trend. Maybe individuals who are just unwilling to change. They've been testing for a while, but this is something that we may want to look into a little bit, although it may not be really useful if this number drops below 1 or 2%. And then we looked at, this is a trend I've presented in a couple other places. Japan, more so than just about any country I've looked at, has a huge performance difference, and I think just about all of this was either an audit or BEC. I need to take a look at that again. But you can see the performance for women sitting for the exam was around a 21%, 22% pass rate, and the men was 40%, and that gap has grown dramatically since the, well, CBTE was here, well, since 2012. Again, we don't really know the nature of that trend and why that's happening, but it's something that we want to take a look at in the future. And then first time versus re-exam, nothing really special here. You see first time exam performance higher than re-exam. The Middle East, this is interesting, and this is going to cause a lot of, have a pretty big impact, some of the rule changes that we're anticipating in the future for Middle Eastern candidates. We didn't have a lot of candidates from the Middle East 4 or 5 years ago. That number has increased dramatically over the last few years, particularly since we started testing in the Middle East. And you can see New Hampshire had very few candidates, 400 or 500, and not very few, that's a rather large number. And here we fast forward to 2012, and almost 75, 80% of the candidates from the Middle East sitting are going to New Hampshire. This is going to be very interesting because New Hampshire is putting rules in place in the middle of 2014 that are going to be dramatically more difficult than they are now. So individuals who are sitting for the examination through there have to proactively look at where else they can go. There are certain countries out there, Egypt, a lot of the Egyptian candidates have a very good education, meaning that their education fits nicely with many, many jurisdictions' requirements. But from a comfort zone perspective, they're all still going to New Hampshire because they see that as sort of an easier pathway, leave nothing to chance. And the problem that these individuals are going to encounter, and I think you guys have seen this and Rick has mentioned this, a lot of candidates sit in New Hampshire and now they want to go to Washington or Montana, Texas, somewhere else to get licensed because the licensure requirements in New Hampshire are so difficult, and I think they're one of the hardest bars to pass for the licensing side. So it's kind of an interesting trend, interesting topic for us to look at. Let's see, go back here. And let me take you back to Japan. I mean, this is the Japanese donut chart compared to the Middle East. And if you look at a country like India, I don't have India on here, but a year or two ago, you saw a vast majority of them going through Colorado because Colorado, their education requirements seemed to fit the Indian candidates much more. They had education in lieu of experience, various things like that that made it more attractive. I think as Colorado's rules tighten quite a bit, the Indian candidates are looking for other areas, whether it's Illinois, items like that. And then we tossed this one as well. Similar to the Japanese trends, there's really not a huge difference in performance between individuals who are educated in the United States versus educated at some international location, most likely their home country. And then the gender, and this is what you would typically see. I mean, you see a lot of variability due to the low numbers, particularly after the change to the CBTE. But really not a lot of performance difference between men and women on the examination there. And you see that normally in most of the countries. Japan is just a very unique trend that we hadn't seen before. The test center adoption, this is not unexpected. I think the adoption for international candidates sitting in the Middle East versus coming to the U.S., it was a much more rapid adoption than Guam because, again, the travel from Middle East to the United States is much more expensive than maybe Japan to Guam. So this is the initial data set. We have so much more we can potentially present, and I think based on how the conversations here go over the next few months, we could compile and aggregate a lot more information and share it with you all and maybe broaden the discussion, but I'll turn it back over to Ted and we get to the next part of the discussion.
Any comments relative to, it's a summary, obviously, any comments relative to that presentation that he's made?
Yeah, just on that first page where you talk about the different, Hong Kong, for example, pass rate, 54.4. What comes to mind, and this goes back probably 5 or 6 years ago, I was on the IQOP committee, and we studied that Hong Kong MRA.
I turned it on.
We spent a lot of time on their, they talked a lot about their education requirements in Hong Kong. We got the actual 4 books of modules they used to study. The education was a big deal, I remember. And then I went off that committee. They received the MRA, what, 2 years ago, I think?
Maybe.
But it's funny how we spent a lot of time on that education part, and now they've done so well here. I know there's not as many candidates. What's happening there? What does that mean when you see that? I mean, they're 54% versus everyone else is even close. 54.4.
Yeah.
Those may not be two different groups of people. So you're talking about, for the MRA, you're talking about the CPAs who are already Hong Kong CPAs qualifying through IQEX.
During the IQEX exam.
This is someone who can't qualify for IQEX.
They did
not
just
a
wake
member
up.
of that institute, so they're coming in through the normal path of another international student.
I think that was an old issue too, right? The rules over there changed in the last 10 years. I think about that.
Right, they worked really hard they really wanted to enter the MRA with us, so they did a lot of changes.
Well, isn't the IQEX exam now just the
That's
practice?
just for the IQEX.
But it's changed. The IQEX has changed the exam.
The
It's
IQEX
It's
is
just what? It's just practice or
Right.
something?
But those numbers are going to be.
I got it, though.
They should be CPA exam candidates, not IQEX.
I got it. I understand. But they did change that IQEX exam quite a bit. I used to work on the AICPA side of the exam, the IQEX, and pretty much gone now.
We use the reg section and the CPA exam.
And it's computer, not HTTP.
It's all computer-based and it's under the same scale.
That's the other exam. I wasn't thinking about that.
Right.
Dave, you had some comments?
I was going to say, I think the biggest difference in the pass rates is really attributable to the difference in language and age. Because you find that the countries where, like Japan and Korea, they know English, but they only know English from a reading standpoint. They can read it, but they can't really speak it. So they have a harder time with the language than in other countries like Hong Kong and some of the other, like Egypt, in China, where English is more prevalent for the people that are actually taking the exam. They actually speak it. Right. Versus the Japanese and Koreans, they can read it very well, but they don't always understand it very well.
That was an issue with Mexico and the IQUICs. They were always low performance, different exam. It was because of that reason.
Yeah, and the same is true of the age, because for us, the Japanese candidates that we were in the past getting were older and had been out of school longer and were taking prep courses and things that they had a lot higher gap to make.
Right. Well, and that's a good point. We're looking at the BEC performance rates, and I think everyone's seeing those trend up. But if you look at a lot of the international countries, and BEC particularly, you'll see that pass rate trend down noticeably.
Ours is opposite of what the U.S. is because of the foreign versus the U.S.
Right.
candidates.
Right.
We have older candidates and less comfortable in terms of.
What is the U.S. average pass rate?
Well, it's 46%.
What is the U.S. pass rate is the question.
Which section? Well, it's the same whatever this is here.
Overall, 46 to 50% in most cases. In different sections.
Yeah, it's 46% as far as Q4 of 2012.
46?
It fluctuates quarter over quarter. You have individuals who graduate in May. They sit in the third quarter, so that's every single year is the highest performing, and then it sort of trends down from there.
Other comments on the initial presentation of the statistics? Okay. If not, we have a memo that starts in the back, and it kind of explains, kind of walk you through some of it. It's kind of boards of accountancy review. It's in the back of, it's behind the materials attached to it. And we're just going to cover certain sections in substance. You can look at examinations and licensure, and basically what we're saying there, each state, the states that are listed deal with business and accounting courses, and then policies by respective states. Some say auditing, some say tax has to be U.S. You can see the various categorizations there. We also have a section there dealing with U.S. accredited schools abroad. And so that gives us the criteria as to, what associations, the Higher Learning Commission in North Central, and the various associations that are looked upon as highly. One of the issues that we face in this deals with residency requirements. And we've got a series of questions there that require you to be able to sit. You have to be a resident of the respective state. So you can see there's about 9 states there that have a residency requirement that has an impact upon what we're involved in with regards to where the candidates are going to take the exam. Then if we look at board rules and policies, we've got a section here that deals with past rule changes. And some of the things that we've seen in the statistics are obviously a direct result of various states making rule changes and when they become effective. So you can see Delaware and Maine has some new rules that came in earlier this year. Tennessee has rules relative to what you think, what kind of courses you take and all. Those are the things that we talk about as having an impact upon the direction or the future direction of where the candidates are going to go in regards to his pie charts that are there from that standpoint. Now what we look at is we know that those are passed and they're coming into play in 2012 or have come into play in 2012. But for 2013, we've got some new rules that are coming to play. And as those rules come into effect, they will also. So you can see if you look at Colorado, you see the new rules that go in effect in July of 2015. Guam has some changes which Dave certainly would be aware of. Illinois is going into some new rules, which come into July of 2013, deal with the completion of 150 hours and bachelor's degree, etc. And also Michigan, and then New Hampshire. So New Hampshire came up effectively on our chart as being a place they were going, but effective in 14, there's be some changes that will probably cause people to go in a different direction as is where they're taking the exam. New Jersey has obviously, but they haven't determined the date on that one particular at this point. You can look at the rest, Utah and Vermont. So each of those are the ones initially we talked about were in the past in 12, and they had an impact. They had an impact upon the results of where the statistics of where they're going. We've got other states that are continuing to make changes. The reason that we put this material out is so that you as a jurisdiction in the process of changing your rules or maybe looking at your rules, they have an impact upon what's going on in the international community. And so that's important for you to just kind of have an understanding of what's occurring in that area. James?
So this is obviously not a comprehensive list of all the rules. I think an interesting discussion point here is there's so much variability in the rules that an international candidate particularly has to look at to see if they want to go to a particular jurisdiction. So let's say New Hampshire enacts rules that become much more difficult, and they're going to do that in the middle of next year. Well, you may be a jurisdiction that really isn't thinking about the international candidates and sitting rather passive and not making any changes, but all of a sudden your jurisdiction may be much more appealing based on a rule change that you may or may not have intended to make or that's been on the books for a while. So it's eventually, if a lot of jurisdictions like Colorado that are, and New Hampshire, Delaware, places that used to be places, I don't want to say close the door, but become more restrictive, you may all of a sudden wake up tomorrow and see 500 candidates coming through. And we've seen even places like New Mexico, I would have never thought going through there that that'd be a large destination, but we're seeing a growing number going to there. Montana is one of the key destinations, and I think one of the reasons is they don't have necessarily a degree requirement. I think they have a total course load or hours requirement. So these smaller total population jurisdictions are continuing to grow, and I don't know if a lot of the EDs or the boards are prepared for that or understand why those changes are happening.
I think you need to distinguish between the requirements for sitting for the exam as a candidate versus licensure, because a lot of them want to go to the easiest place they can qualify to sit, but once they pass, they'll transfer their grades to somewhere else that's easier to get a license. And we had some issues with that when Maine did their thing with accounting, and we actually put out the memo that said, if you go to Maine and sit for the exam because you don't have the accounting hours, we're not going to accept your transfer of grades for licensing because you didn't fulfill our education requirements before you sat.
Right.
So there is a big difference between qualifying to sit somewhere versus qualifying for licensure.
Yeah, and I think that's a lack of knowledge for a lot of the candidates. And one thing that we're doing with, you know,
I beg to differ with you, because when I put out that memo, I got 3 different schools in Japan sending me emails about how come you changed the thing, and we've been sending our candidates there because it's easy to get them through here, and then we'll send them there. They know exactly what they're doing.
the school and the candidates as well.
It's not confusion at all.
Well, we talked to a lot of candidates on the international evaluation side, and they want to sort of know where to go, and I think we've provided a lot more information to the individuals, and a lot of responses we get are, hey, my friend tells me I need to go to this jurisdiction because of A, B, and C, and when we explain the entire process front to end, that it's not just the examination, you also have to get licensing, I don't think it deters everyone or convinces everyone to sort of pick a better jurisdiction or one that better fits their education, but I think it's starting to
Those schools
change.
The prep schools were the ones in.
Absolutely.
Where they went.
One thing, I'm sorry, what?
Lang?
Well, I was going to say, is this a problem, all these international students that kind of cherry pick jurisdictions to take the exam? And
Can't hear you.
I was saying, is it a problem? We have all these international students that are, cherry picking jurisdictions to take the exam, then other jurisdictions to get licensed. And my guess in the U.S. is that most of the candidates take it where they live, and that's where they get licensed. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually not necessarily true. When you look, when New Hampshire or Maine made that change in 2008, I think they had 5 or 6% were New Hampshire or Maine residents. About 20 to 30% were outside of Maine, or 40%, and then the remainder were international. So there's still a rather large number of U.S. candidates who are doing what you're saying, cherry picking, right?
Wendy?
I just kind of wanted to agree with some of the conversation. I do think even the U.S. candidates looked, and I thought New Hampshire was relatively attractive because it had no experience requirements. So it didn't necessarily have to do with your degree and your education as much as once you pass the exam there, you didn't have to, there's the residency and the hours to actually get certified. So it goes more to the point he was making before, is the licensure requirements. And I do think they're very cognizant of that when they're shopping for jurisdictions.
They're also looking for anybody who's two-tiered. They wanted a certificate, and all that changed. New Hampshire used to issue a nice certificate when you pass the exam. They no longer do that. So there's different scenarios that came into play. Like Delaware was two-tiered. That's why they were going there. Delaware opted out of international, so of course they moved somewhere else. So Maine originally was opted out of international while they did their rule change. When that happened, and you start seeing them come back, so they do shop around. I think the bigger concern that everyone should be focused on is: are the candidates still going just to take the exam, or are they actually pursuing license? And I get a lot of calls from Middle East candidates in particular who are going there and then saying, well, what do I do next to get my license? I don't understand why the requirements are different for me to get my license. And then several of them question, well, do I actually have to obtain my license? And when do my scores expire? So you get into this whole thing of explaining that you made an agreement with us
Right.
when we allowed you to test in the Middle East to pursue licensing, so you're obligated to do that. But I don't know that every state's going to enforce that.
So what I
In the
would
back.
say along that lines, Montana has 120 hours to take the exam. And then we're still duals. We have a certificate and then a licensing process. And we have a lot of international people who get the certificate because we don't require when they take the exam as they do on an international site to get licensed. They're coming to Montana right now. We tried to get rid of that this last legislative session, and the legislature wouldn't approve it.
Yeah.
What do you mean get licensed? That's you're losing it.
Two-tier.
Two-tier.
We're the state in New Mexico, where we do the 120, but you can take it, and you get your license after you get to 150.
No, that's
You
the
get a
sit to get
certificate.
licensed.
That's, you're,
He's
A
still
certificate
two-tier
that
like
says,
the old
You know,
two-tier.
Joe Blow's a CPA, it's a CPA certificate, but they don't have a license to practice.
oh,
So
And there's fewer states like that, but they are out there.
And we anticipate a lot of
Illinois?
candidates are going to go to Montana
Illinois.
once New Hampshire's rules change, so you all may see a flood of candidates sometime next year.
what is
beyond words.
Question
Wait,
I have.
Kate?
I'll be happy for them to go to Montana.
Okay. Kate?
In Minnesota, we've had a lot of inquiries from colleges and universities about partnering with Chinese schools to have students take much of their education at the foreign university, come to our Minnesota schools, take their accounting and some of their business. That would transfer back to the foreign school. They would issue their degree there, and then they should be able to sit in Minnesota, even with a resident, because they would have met the
Residency requirement? Okay.
So that the schools are being very proactive because they see this as a fertile ground, particularly the four-year private schools who have become very expensive, and they find that if they can put together a package that's going to benefit the school and benefit the students too, quite frankly.
Right.
It's a good thing.
I have a question about the licensure thing, but what Pat was saying is the consent letter, I guess, if an international candidate says, I'm going to get licensed in 3 years, and the question is how many of them actually pursue the licensure, and we get the questions about, well, what if I don't get it in 3 years? And I did ask that question, and I was told, well, they get dropped off the list, but the scores are really still there, so if they come back 2 years after that, they can still get licensed.
Okay.
Yeah.
The question I have is anybody tracking how many of the U.S. candidates that pass get licensed, and how many of them are actually getting licensed in 3 years? And, you know, the AICPA says you can now be a full voting member without ever being a licensed CPA, so they could care less. So.
It's a big one.
I mean, how many of the U.S. candidates that pass are actually getting licensed? Do we know?
I don't think we've tracked that.
We don't track that.
So why don't we have a consent letter for the U.S. candidates? You want to incent licensure?
That's above my pay grade.
That might be something you could
Actually, you know,
I got the question. I'll write it down.
so there was a point that somebody had made, I can't remember who we were discussing this with, but it was related to the 3 years. So because of the two-tier requirements, so 120, 150, there's a lot of international candidates who sign the consent form. They sit at 120, and now within 3 years, they have to get the remaining 30 hours of education plus the experience. So even if they wanted to do the entire process in 3 years, I think there was mention that it may be unrealistic for some of the candidates, and I don't know what you all's perspective is on that, but that may be worth
I think it
talking
is
about.
unrealistic because of the cost, but on the other hand, as long as they get their notice of grades of passing, and they can get their employer to accept it, they don't really care anyway. By then, they've got their raise, and that's all they're really concerned with.
In the back?
I was gonna say,
Okay.
they don't have a certificate that says CPA.
They don't need one,
They don't need one?
not as long as they have
It's a resume builder for a lot.
yeah, I mean,
They
for
just
most
prove
of
that
them,
they-
they just want to get proof they passed, so they get their raise. They
So-
get a 40% raise when they pass the exam, that's all that matters.
Does would NASBA have information by state as to what happens? For example, I don't know in New Mexico, the 30 hours, I understand the difference there, but I don't know if we give them a time period, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever. Or do we don't even track that information?
Well,
or-
we're tracking international.
But it doesn't have to do with the states.
The
We
challenge
don't-
is, one challenge is the question about licensure, and I was gonna mention it this afternoon when I speak, is we have the gateway system, which tracks all the candidates for the CPA examination, and then we have ALD and CPA Verified, which tracks licensure. They don't talk right now. So to know if a candidate for the CPA exam has been licensed, there's no handshake between them, and that's something, an initiative that we're
Right.
working.
There's
Well,
only,
yeah.
right now I'm manually looking them up.
Well, in the ALD information we give you, the candidate ID was really should be able to pass.
Not everybody has,
Well, the one.
and that's part of the problem. So the flag, it's about the trigger, the flag, so you don't know that it's not signing off to each other. So you don't know if that candidate's in international, that's what you're not handing off to. So we're working with Washington right now, trying to figure out how to make that work so the two systems will talk to each other. So that will make it
It's
easier.
an important initiative, and it's a big initiative, because, you know, we're dealing with each stage separate licensure system, you know, as we're pulling stuff to ALD, and the state has to track it too, so.
And we'll be coming up on that 3-year mark for the first one to sound international. We're obligated to.
Yeah, but I'd venture to guess that you probably have as many or more U.S. candidates that pass and never get a license.
I wouldn't disagree with you.
It's not a requirement.
It's not a requirement.
Never. Why not?
I know I'm talking too much at 10.
Go ahead.
And David, those Japanese candidates or Koreans go to Guam and sit in Guam, they're not required to get licensed either.
I know they're not Guam candidates.
Leonard?
Just more of
Go
a
ahead.
comment. You know, New Mexico's
Okay.
a small state. We don't have that many candidates to take the exam. I guess, I just went off the board after a bunch of years in New Mexico. They said, thank goodness, he's gone finally. But once I got off, there was a need, in fact, you got the email, or Tom Kenny got the email. We were doing work, and the question came up at the board meeting, the first one that I missed in February, I was off the board. They brought up the issue about the CPA exam, and the concern of the new board, a couple of them came to this meeting, one new member came to this meeting, was that why is the pass rate so low in New Mexico? I mean, what's going on? And we mentioned it was 46, and the chart you gave, I think, is 25 or something that we're at, the latest one you sent me. And my point is the detailed information that Pat and these guys have, and James is unbelievable at NASBA to capture all that information. But we're way below that pass rate. And then also we have it by the universities there in New Mexico. I didn't know all that, and I've been involved in NASBA a long time. I'm just saying for the states that are here, keep that in mind. The information that's available from these guys is unbelievable. And so what we're gonna do, we're gonna try to have him come to town on Monday for a meeting with the State Society and the board. He's busy, but he's gonna be available for a conference with our committee. And the starting information we have to work with is unbelievable, that people have thought, well, where are we gonna get all this information at? They've got it. It's really a plug for NASPA and the kind of information they have available for each state. I mean, I look at this information of the candidates, where they're from, the Bahamas. I mean, he's got the whole breakdown here for us. And candidates from the Caribbean countries generally show lowest average performance. I mean, all kinds of detail that I didn't know was available. So keep it in mind in different states that it's available for you guys to look at. Because we're way off the net. What the average is 46%.
I'm not looking for work.
We speak English in New Mexico. We're not in Mexico, by the way. We have also is that in the United States? Yeah, we are. Anyway, that's the other part. There's a lot of good information from these guys.
So if we kind of look at, well, that last item there deals with 3-year degrees, and it just talks about what some states accept, the equivalency and all. But if what we're seeing from this short memo, and it's just a summary of things that we have, is that some jurisdictions are becoming more restrictive, obviously, and others, as it relates to international education, are becoming less restrictive. Well, what's the impact or potential impact of that upon the overall profession, I guess, is a question I throw on the table.
I think particularly with the perspective of mobility. So if you are really trying to protect the public and become very, very restrictive, but then there's another pathway, there may be some interesting discussions or topics back there to discuss.
No?
I'm a bit of an outsider here, so I found this all very interesting. Your very first slide was where the international candidates are, and I just wonder, at a sort of broad level, is there a sort of a strategic sort of, are you looking to increase international candidates, or, because I'm sort of thinking the competition might be, say, the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants in the United Kingdom has gone for a very international strategy of sort of getting accreditation with the ACCA designation, whereas the sort of more respected qualification that of a chartered accountant in the United Kingdom, the ICAEW, has pretty much focused on their core business within England and Wales. So I wondered, I might have missed, the step before all of this, and that is sort of, is this seen as a growth area, or because people are actually, cherry picking the states they do. I mean, it's a great demonstration, but are you trying to keep people out? Are you trying to recruit them?
So I think, I may not be the best person to speak to this, but I think we're still maybe trying to find an identity around that. I think prior to sitting internationally, it feels like it was more passive growth. Maybe where the Big Four was going, there were individuals who became familiar with the CPA examination, and you saw growth in those areas. The international testing with the selected markets that we're in, I think, has sort of changed the growth, particularly in the Middle East. But I know if somebody else, AICPA or Colleen, you all want to.
Oh. We have an institute in New Zealand, so I wouldn't expect to see New Zealand on the list.
Locally placed. Well, New Zealand, we have an arm.
Sure.
The history of testing internationally is that some of the states came to NASPA and said, we want our candidates to have the ability, our international candidates and our U.S. citizens abroad, to have the ability to take the examination at international locations. We have a partnership with Prometric. They have test centers around the world. talk about a resume builder, they work internationally. They have U.S. clients, they have companies that have a U.S. presence, they work for a U.S. company abroad. The larger firms move people around and they want their people to be able to be able to show the knowledge of the United States audit and tax, and this is the way to do it. That's kind of the history.
And John, also maybe to clarify, these MRAs are only with certain organizations within those countries. I don't know New Zealand very well, but I've worked on the Australian MRA, and we have an MRA with one group, but not with other groups over there. So there's sort of a slicing, if you will, of these groups.
Yeah. Mike, you had a comment?
Yeah, just try to explain where the candidates come from as well, I guess.
I think they're pretty much independent, right? Because the MRAs is a completely...
MRA is a whole different
Yeah,
program.
within
So
the-
if
Yeah.
you are a chartered accountant from Canada and want to become a U.S. CPA, so there's a fast track, in essence, to become, once you have one credential, get the other, and it's vice versa. The U.S. CPA wants to become a chartered accountant.
Yeah. Mike?
Mike.
On Colleen's comments with respect to the future growth, you heard Ken Bishop comment yesterday that the ISFK worked on that. Most of these countries was part of a pilot agreement, so we chose countries where the exam could be kept secure, but where we could promote licensure and promote the AS, the CPA license globally. I think that's the goal of both organizations, is to promote the license. And we need to do so securely in order to protect what we can see and protect the exam as well. So I think you'll see in the shorter term added countries that are similar to these countries here in what we call a Rules One approach. Larger countries, China, India, any other area, need to be done and approached a little bit more selectively, and ASCK and NASDAQ will need to work together on that. So more to come, but we need to do so carefully.
But I think part of the mission was to
Okay.
create a global standard of and then from a state standpoint, Maine, Washington State, that's revenue.
You also want to educate them on everything from the license.
Yeah.
The exam itself is just a component of it, so they could pull themselves out of the CPAs or get more information.
And protect the state model, which just
Wendy?
So we're 2 years since the initial administration for the first couple countries. So I realize it's still very new, but has anybody in any of these jurisdictions been licensed yet?
Yes, predominantly in Washington.
So they are,
So there are people seeking license. Washington actually has the highest ratio of candidates who are going for the exam and obtaining an actual license. They also see people coming from other states who test in other states going to Washington.
Yeah, I'd have to say too that most of in Guam, we don't have a lot of Guam candidates. We have a lot sitting in the test centers that aren't Guam candidates, but out of the 500 or so candidates we get every year, most of them actually do get a license in Guam.
And it seems to be predominant, the Japanese seem to be obtaining a license at a much higher rate than the Indians.
Rick, any comments you have about what the process is going on with you?
No, we're just getting ready to, I'm getting ready to send out letters to those candidates who haven't licensed. And that's what that's trying to help us identify them. To remind them that we're certainly ready and available to collect their money and it's a business piece of it.
Rick, why Washington? Is it just the affinity location-wise, or something beyond that?
Is it the 120?
Licensing requirements are easy.
The 120 and all that is,
Easy.
Dave says that
Easy.
we're easy because we don't have this law requirements.
Lowering the threshold?
Yeah.
How can you be a U.S. CPA and not have knowledge whatsoever? I don't understand the Washington guys.
So we're we're 150 to sit and
Oh.
150 to license, so.
You are the 150, okay.
Basket weaving, what else did you say?
You get tapped in.
Yeah. Come on.
No, he said
Do you want to, so we have,
I took the second. I mean, I answered the second question.
yeah.
I don't think I have any more. Look and see what you think about the ones we have. I don't think we have it.
So actually, you know, it may be interesting. There's two topics. We've got about 15 minutes that may be worthwhile to talk about here. One of it is the Indian candidates, and obviously their education system is very different. I think India, Pakistan, very different from what you would traditionally see in Europe or a lot of Asia or the Middle East. And there is a very diverse set of expectations from jurisdictions on how to accept or not to accept the education, whether they accept it as 3-year degrees, as 3 years plus additional hours to get to the 120, or do they need the entire 120 like an MCOM versus a BCOM in order to sit for the examination. And the other topic I think is really worthwhile maybe having, whether it's here or down the road again, is the growth in China. I mean, we've seen, you guys have seen this, 100% year-over-year growth, and unless something changes dramatically over the next couple decades, Chinese candidates should outnumber the U.S. candidates. And what does that do, when it comes to regulating the profession with so many candidates that are, or individuals who are potentially going to be licensed or looking for licensure outside the United States? So maybe I'll leave it up to you all which topic you guys think would be worthwhile chatting about a little bit. No.
You might mention some about the Indian education where they have the 3-year degree, but I understand that some of the evaluation services actually accept the additional coursework or papers they have to do as part of their work experience requirement before they get licensed in India. You know about that?
Repeat it up. Okay. Repeat his question.
So Dave was asking about the 3-year Indian education and then some of the evaluation companies or some of the jurisdictions allowing the extra chartered accountants education to account for the additional hours. It's a really interesting topic. I can't remember which jurisdiction it is. There's 1 or 2 jurisdictions that go solely based on what the evaluation company will say. So when we have our international evaluations department, we're going to look at the 3-year education and say this is exactly 3 years, but they have actually the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, I can't remember the exact name, coursework which may account for the other 30 or 40 hours to make it equivalent to 120 so they can sit. Well, another company may say, you know what, this is 3-year BCom, but we're going to make it a 4-year, interpret that as a 4-year without any additional hours. And a jurisdiction will accept that as 4 years because that's how it was evaluated by that company. Even so, we could be doing the work in the exact same jurisdiction, and 2 different companies come to 2 very different conclusions. One may be more conservative, one very liberal, but the jurisdiction will sort of accept that. And it becomes kind of an issue, and I think some of it has to do with the way the rules are written, the rule language is written. And I know it's not going to happen overnight, but I think an area like this, Indian education, it may be worthwhile for all the jurisdictions or many of the jurisdictions to sort of come together, get on the same page on how you believe it should be interpreted, because that education, I mean, those individuals are going to get into your jurisdiction one way or another through mobility eventually, so I think it's worthwhile having the conversation. And I know there's different perspectives and different levels of risk that's assessed by the jurisdiction. So,
Other thoughts?
anybody think it's going to be risky or interesting when there are 100,000 candidates a year from China sitting for the examination? And
I think that if China does for the CPA candidates what they do for the tourists, because they've seen so many outbound Chinese tourists and growth over the last, I think it's 5 or 6 years, it's gone to, in 2012 they had 83 million outbound Chinese tourists, and they predict in 2015 to have 105 million. The Chinese government is basically taken to developing Hunan Island as the inbound tourist destination to replace places like Hawaii and Guam and everything else that they want to keep see 100,000 Chinese trying to take a U.S. CPA exam, don't you think they're going to do something about making it easier to get a Chinese CPA?
Right, potentially. Great. Well, there's, Kate.
I think that, you know, if you, the initial exam taking and the light, you know, evaluation of education, that's kind of a one-time deal. I think the bigger problem will be for jurisdictions to maintain those licenses through their CPE reporting and perhaps complaints and that kind of thing. How do we, I don't know about your boards, but I know we have people who say, we never get anything from you guys. We don't know it's time to do this or that or the other thing. How's this going to happen if we're sending stuff to China? I think the compliance with CPE, if you have that requirement, peer reviews, I mean, all kinds of things are going to be really complicated.
Actually, I talked to Ophelia, was that yesterday, Ophelia? Related to the kind of a interpretation of the rules around Canadian chartered accountants being able to verify education or verify experience, right? And that's sort of going away. I know, Rick, I think we've talked about this a little bit. It's a complex topic. Maybe it's worthwhile having another meeting like this to focus on that so we could do a little bit more research before it. But I don't think anyone's solved that problem.
Well, as part of that issue is, maybe I can ask Rick, but you talked about initial licensure. So how many times do you get an initial license that never gets renewed? Because once they get it and they've fulfilled it and they walk away, we could care less
The
after
Chinese
that.
and the Japanese, which is a big portion of our population, they're signing it back up.
They're very much rule followers.
Yeah.
So
tell them-
ours with the Japanese are, but we don't really have that many Chinese business.
And on the CPE, the one we have is the regulatory ethics that you gotta have every 3 years. And China has some real difficulty with that, the Chinese licensing. But it's not, you know, doesn't wipe them out completely. But the Chinese, about 10% of our population, 15,000, are foreign. And Chinese are 38% of that camp.
We
So,
can turn to you for experience with this, that'd be good.
Yeah,
yeah.
well, most of ours that get licensed are actually go for an inactive license, so they don't really want to practice anyway, so they don't actually have to meet the CPE requirements after that.
So we don't issue a certificate anymore. It's, you get a license and you're not seeking.
Okay.
Awesome.
But I think those are the personal ones. That would be a good discussion to have around that type of issue.
Right.
The enforcement, how do we deal with that? If you've got a Western licensee that goes off the tracks in China, you know, if that's a Chinese resident,
You'd have to be disciplined by somebody in China, right? Because
yeah,
she's
make
not-
it effective.
She's not practicing in your jurisdiction,
Well, he's my licensee though.
right, but,
But I'm not going to China to get it.
persecuted or prosecuted.
So that's an issue.
Right.
I certainly think that the issue of education on a global scale is something that's got to be looked at.
Right.
I personally don't think we need to worry too much about the disciplining an errant Chinese, because when they convicted these guys of bankruptcy, they hung them.
Can't hear you guys.
A little louder.
Said you're going to get hanged in China if you get convicted, was what I heard.
There were some CEO of a company that went bankrupt and didn't pay his employees, and when they convicted him of embezzlement, they hung him.
Yeah.
So I don't think you have to worry about Chinese discipline.
No, that's fine.
All right.
That's why he's not
I'll give you a call.
Ready? Let's cut.
And so
Slightly phenomenal fee.
before we cut loose here, Tom Kenny wanted us to let you know that they're actually going to be moving the Q&A portion up to lunch for a lot of the folks that may want to have a few questions but need to leave a little bit early.
Going back to your question about how you regulate in that respect, a part of what's going on now with this global strategies, which I happen to be chair of, is we're looking out to establish associations with regulators and other international entities. Hopefully through that association, then we can be able to give some degree of assurance that, yes, they're doing what they are saying in accordance, but it's going to be something that's going to be building of time. It's not going to happen right away. But we've identified certain regulators that we're going to try to focus on. And through hopefully our association that we can build with them, we can get to the back part of that. But that's the direction that we're taking. Any other questions, anyone? I thank you very much for coming to look at the statistics and to talk about the perspective of international candidates today. Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks.